Okay, you're good to go.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I never expected this would be so heavy on Californians and Nevadan, but I'm especially glad to be with this group. And if I might digress for a moment, I'll explain why. I have a personal connection to Jonas Salk. In June of 1969, I graduated from my undergraduate years at MIT and headed for University of California, San Diego. And within a few days of arriving, I was doing my first graduate school rotation in the biology department, through the biology department at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, which is right down the road from the university and a stone's throw from where Jack Fisher is. I assume you're in La Jolla, Jack. I was working hard as a grad student, and some evenings I would walk out to a balcony that overlooked the Pacific.
You want me to put the sound on mine and see if it works better?
Sorry, did someone interrupt?
I'm getting an occasional scratchiness in your voice.
Yeah, the sound is breaking up.
I could try a different computer if you think that would help. But I don't know what else to do.
I think it's
It
worth
might
a
not be
try
your
because
fault, maybe
it is fairly difficult to figure out the underlying speech.
Yeah. You want to try logging out and logging back in?
Sure, I can do that. So I was a newly minted grad student doing a rotation at the Salk Institute in the lab of Renato Del Becco. And in the evening sometime, I would take a break from the lab and walk out to one of the Institute's balconies that overlooked the Pacific to watch the sunset. And next to me doing the same thing would be Jonas Salk. And we would chat and became friendly with a repetition of this over many, many days and weeks. And he was very pleasant. We had some things in common. He was a middle-class Jewish kid from New York, and I was a middle-class Jewish kid from Philadelphia. And of course, he had done his seminal work at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. So it was a very heady thing, as you can imagine, having been an undergraduate a week or two before, and now going through this. So anyway, that's my digression. But it does take me back. Now, I want to get to the substance of our discussion today. And please feel free to interrupt if you like, since it's such a small and I think congenial group. A couple of months ago, I saw a tweet by a practicing pediatrician, Deborah Greenhouse, who's from South Carolina. And her tweet was, today, I tried to prescribe amoxicillin for an ear infection. The pharmacy didn't have it. I tried to prescribe Tamiflu for flu. The pharmacy didn't have it. I tried to prescribe Adderall for ADHD. The pharmacy didn't have that either. If that doesn't bother you, it should, she ended. Well, it did bother me. These are important drugs, and these drug shortages are neither rare nor new. Several years ago, University of Chicago researchers did a survey of more than 700 pharmacists in large and small hospitals across the country. And they found that everyone had had at least one significant shortage during the previous year. And more than 2/3 had experienced at least 50 drug shortages during the previous year. The majority of these were not what you might expect. They weren't single producer high profile, high cost new drugs. They were mostly generic injectable drugs, commonly used in hospitals by EMTs and especially in ICUs and emergency rooms. Well, they included many classes of drugs, analgesics, antipsychotics, even IV solutions like D5, 10, 15, 50, and various other solutions. Now, the FDA maintains a list of drugs that are in shortage at any given time. And when I checked yesterday, there were 123 drugs in shortage. And the list, again, is sort of non-intuitive. It includes much of the contents of a medicine cabinet, a medicine storage unit by EMTs and in hospital ICUs and emergency rooms. What's interesting is that in addition to the kinds of drugs that Dr. Greenhouse mentioned, one of the drugs in shortage, irony of ironies, is fentanyl. So there are millions of fentanyl pills coming into the US illegally every month, if not every week. And yet it's on the shortage list. And I present that just as an irony, not suggesting that hospitals should go and buy fentanyl pills at the local drug market. Now, as you'll appreciate, the upshot of this is that hospitals and prescribing docs are having to scramble to find substitute drugs. And that means that many patients are getting their second or third choice of an antibiotic or an ADHD drug or even a cancer drug, which is not a good thing. So my proposal that I've written about several times, most recently in the last couple of weeks, is that one partial solution to this would be reciprocal approvals of new drugs or even of old drugs between FDA and an A list of its counterparts abroad. So if a drug was approved in, say, the European Union or Scandinavia or Australia or Canada or Japan, it would automatically be approved in the US with only a short delay while the FDA worked out labeling, US labeling in the appropriate format, and of course, in English. So that would make many of these drugs available, especially ones that might be produced in, say, Europe or in Scandinavia or Canada by small or medium-sized manufacturers who simply were too small to have submitted a new drug application to FDA and in order to get into the US market. So that would provide a lot more sources potentially of these drugs that are in shortage in the US. Another problem that would be solved by reciprocity of approvals is the situations where FDA has dragged its feet unconscionably in delaying the approval of important drugs. And a couple of examples of that are Bexsero, the meningitis B vaccine, which was approved in Europe in 2013, but not by the FDA until 2015. And there were several large outbreaks in prisons and military bases and college dorms of meningitis B during those 2 years of delay. Another example was the very long delay before the FDA finally approved Fluad, an adjuvanted flu vaccine in 2015. The drug was first approved in 1997 in Italy and soon thereafter by other European countries, but FDA didn't approve it until 2015. So again, that's the sort of delay that would be obviated by these reciprocal approvals. Another problem that's admittedly a rare one that would be avoided by reciprocal approvals is that occasionally FDA senior officials, mainly division directors, have decided to, out of whole cloth, come up with new requirements for approving a new drug. So, for example, one division director decided that a drug not only had to be safe and effective, but had to be superior to existing drugs for the same indication, which, first of all, is extra legal. Second of all, doesn't make sense because different patients respond differently to different drugs, of course. And third, there's a subtle reason that that's a bad idea. It's that many of the indications that are approved indications for drugs are not the first indication for which FDA granted approval. And so if you deny approval for that first indication because it's not superior, but only as good as the other drugs for that indication that are available, many companies would simply not pursue development of the drug and just give it up instead of going on to other indications. So reciprocity would have a number of advantages. And in effect, the stage has sort of been set already for such a move. So through something called the International Conference on Harmonization, FDA and other regulatory agencies have adopted the same format for electronic submission of requests for approval of new drugs, and also have already put in place reciprocity of inspections of facilities, so that every country doesn't have to go to other countries in order to carry out manufacturing facility inspections. Now, although I think the net benefits of reciprocity far outweigh any possible disadvantages, it does create some dilemmas. For example, what happens to trials, say late stage phase 3 trials that are already underway in the US, if say Switzerland or the EU agency or Australia approves the drug and it automatically thereby becomes approved in the US? Would the manufacturer stop the phase 3 trials? They are expensive after all. And it seems rather pointless. And would that be a good thing? We'd be deprived of more data, but the drug would already be approved. Similarly, what happens to a pending new drug application in the US if the drug is approved by a foreign regulatory agency? Does it just go away? Does FDA continue the review, which often requires 2 years or more? Who knows? Another issue is kind of a legal one, and that's that the approval by a reciprocating country would constitute what's legally called a rebuttable presumption of approval. In other words, the approval would be subject only to FDA presenting real evidence of why it shouldn't be approved or why the labeling should be modified and so on. So if FDA were to think that it had evidence for blocking the approval or altering the labeling substantially, who would arbitrate between them? It's hard to know. The international organizations are usually not equipped to do that, either by law or by expertise. Finally, would drug companies, if reciprocity were in place, would drug companies start forum shopping and start submitting applications to national authorities that they consider to be the easiest, the most lenient, or the quickest? If I were head of regulatory affairs at a major drug company, that's probably what I would suggest doing, frankly. FDA is considered by some to be the gold standard in regulatory accuracy and quality, but they also have a reputation of dragging their feet at times and raising spurious questions. So I think the bottom line is that we need to remedy those chronic shortages that we have in the U.S. Currently, and reciprocity of approvals would be one good way to do that, and would also ameliorate some of these ancillary obstacles and glitches in U.S. regulation as well. So I think that's all I'm going to say on this for the moment. I certainly welcome discussion and questions about this or related issues. Yes, Mick.
So Henry, one of the possibilities I think is you lay out a scenario in which the FDA is forced to approve something because it's approved in another country, and then you lay out some difficulties associated with that. And I think it could be done if you put it under something like we've done with COVID vaccines, maybe an emergency authorization where you could get it for certain aspects, but you really still have the incentive for the company to continue with its own NDA in the US and to continue the clinical trials, etc. The biggest issue with clinical trials, I mean, I agree that the company wouldn't want to pay for them if they didn't think they were going to get any further value out of it. But you could also argue that maybe the patients wouldn't want to be in a clinical trial and potentially get a placebo or an old drug if in fact it was available through some other scheme in the US already.
Well, that latter point is a very important one. And of course, we see that with FDA's accelerated approvals as well. Accelerated approvals, as most of you will know, can be based on surrogate endpoints rather than a definitive clinical benefit endpoint. And so if and there has to be a confirmatory trial with real endpoints down the road. Well, if the drug is approved for emergency under accelerated approval, why would anyone sign up for a clinical trial, the confirmatory clinical trial, especially if it's for a serious disease for which there's no good current therapy? And that language is also part of the criteria for accelerated approval. So I take your point, and that would be limiting it to emergency use authorizations would be a kind of a preliminary or a partial step. But again, we have 123 drugs that are currently in shortage. There's an acute shortage as well as a chronic shortage of ADHD drugs in particular now. Antibiotics, I could argue, are an emergency situation as well, because we don't want to have to go to second or third line antibiotics, which might not work and might not be as appropriate, and so on. So then we get into the business of deciding what constitutes an emergency situation for some of these drugs. FDA would probably argue to keep the list relatively limited in order not to preempt their prerogatives. But I think there were good comments. Yes, Alan.
I'm not sure that I understand the reciprocity issue relationship to the shortage issue. I mean, I'm more of an economist than a scientist, so I just don't understand why there's a shortage, and just getting other drugs approved wouldn't really seem directly relevant. But why is there a shortage of drugs that are commonly used in the marketplace? I mean, I've seen it here in New York as well. I just don't get why there's shortages. There never were, you know, within the last 4 or 5 years. Before that, I'd never heard of shortages in the 20 years before that.
That's my
Nick,
question.
I saw
as
your
well,
hand go up.
Henry.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I want to answer the question because, you know, having been in the pharma industry for 40 years, I think a lot of the rationale for why there are drug shortages at the moment is we've got supply issues for either the drugs themselves or for the intermediates that they're made from. And it's related to the fact that over the last 30 odd years, there's been more and more enthusiasm for big drug companies to move their manufacturing and sourcing of materials over to China. And I think that's where we've had a lot of issues. When I first started working for Bristol Myers back in 1980, we used to produce at Bristol Myers in Syracuse an intermediate called 6-APA, which is the sort of, it's the building block for penicillin and cephalosporins. And in Syracuse, we used to ferment this material. We would produce 50% of the world's supply. Now, nothing comes out of that site in Syracuse. So it's all been outsourced. The site has been shut down, the site's still there for other reasons, but the penicillin production has been shut down completely. And this is typical of all the drugs that we made when I was at Gilead. We would always go out to China to try and find raw materials because they were always cheaper. And in fact, what we did is we had an employee who was Chinese who wanted to go back to China, and we sent him over there to build a group specifically to bring in the materials that we would use for all the drugs that we were working on. So we've created our own sort of single source bottleneck. And I think that's part of what's creating the problem for us today.
Yeah, but one of the problems I have, you know, studying this and a lot of related issues, not besides drugs, a lot of other things in the supply chain, that the international sourcing has been cited in a lot of cases as a rationale, but they really had nothing to do with it. So if that's what this problem is, I haven't heard that, but if the problem is getting it from China, because as far as I can tell, in a lot of other spheres, although people don't like the fact that China is the supply chain of a lot of products to this country, there hasn't been any disruption. So it's been other issues. And that's my problem, is that we don't know why it is. People who want to use China as a scam, maybe China is the problem, I don't know, but I haven't heard any evidence that it is. It just is a great cop-out if there's other issues, especially ones caused by regulation or, you know, other things. And you just need to look at the baby formula as evidence of that. They tried to blame all kinds of things, but, you know, they tried to blame international stuff. It turned out it was the FDA itself that was the problem, and not being able to get stuff. So I'm just hoping that there's a way we can actually find what those shortage with the shortages for Adderall and the other two things you made? It doesn't strike me that they would have the same reason that those three unrelated items would be in shortage.
Well, you-
Henry,
you-
I am recalling reading some, this would go back years, and it's the kind of thing that you would write about. And it did give numbers with respect to the percentage of drugs or drug components manufactured in China, and it was a breathtakingly high percentage. And the example they cited was vitamin C, common everyday ascorbic acid. All the ascorbic acid in the world that's used in chewables and every other form of vitamin C are made in one place in China. Now, did you write about that, or
Yeah,
would I have
I-
seen that?
I did. I'm trying to, I omitted it from my notes here. It's a very high percentage of drug intermediates that come from China. And that's quite a problem. But I wanted to respond to Alan's comment about infant formula. That's a good example. It's not a medicine per se, but it certainly acts like one. It had one producer was producing 40% of these specialized formulas. And when FDA found that there was contamination at their plant, the plant was shut down for a very long time, and that was the source of the shortage. Now, if in my example, if there had been reciprocity of approval, the European versions of those specialty formulas that they make would automatically have been marketable here. But instead, FDA needed to go through a very cumbersome process of declaring an emergency, getting the machinery in place to begin bringing these products in. And so that's a very good example. The other broader answer to your first question, Alan, is that a lot of these products are of such low value, like sterile normal saline and sterile 5% dextrose in water and 10%, if you can believe this, the different concentrations of sterile dextrose in water are on the shortage list. D5W, D10W, D25, and D50. How can you not be able to make sugar water, a sterile sugar water in the US to avoid a shortage? Well, it's low value, it's low interest, but there are other companies abroad who do make this. So that's, I think, a very good example of the kind of product that could immediately be on the market, automatically be on the market, if we had reciprocity of approvals.
So it sounds to me like it's a little bit backwards. The problem isn't that we've got too much stuff sourced from China. It's that from outside the US, it's that we don't have enough.
Well, except I don't know how happy hospitals would be with made in China sterile solutions. I just don't.
No, but my point isn't that it's China. And I happen to know a lot about China in particular because I have a brother who's lived in Hong Kong and produces low value stuff out of China and has for 40 years. But the problem is it doesn't have to be China. It could be abroad from different places abroad. So with me, I'm not a fan of saying we've got to produce everything here. We need to have diversified sources, but they don't have to be here, because as an economist, forcing ourselves to produce low value stuff here only makes everybody in this country poorer, and in particular, the poorest among us are hit worst.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the issue is, you know, the lack of redundancy. That's the problem. If we could make, you know, cheap drugs in Mexico or South America or something else that would, you know, meet the appropriate standards, I'm sure that would be good too. But for whatever reason, the pharmaceutical industry has gravitated towards and been sucked into using China, probably just because of the significant economic advantage of doing it. And
Well, isn't
Well,
India still a big player in this too? India.
they're a big player in terms of generic drugs, but in terms of raw materials, not so much.
Oh.
Well, I can tell you one of the reasons that China is a really big supplier, and this I know from my brother. My brother's tried to do factories in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in India, in Burma, you know, Myanmar, and all over. And the reason he does the majority of his production in China is because they are better. Their workers are better. The regulations are better. The market is freer. And the government is less burdensome. That's why. So what needs to happen is the other countries in the world need to get their act together and mimic. Nobody wants to do China. My brother says he's got a lot of problem. People don't want the stuff sourced in China. Apple has said that they're not going to continue to source all of their things in China. But what they've kind of admitted, which nobody wants to look at, is if they source it in India or the other places in Vietnam, it's going to be much more expensive because those countries are not as good at producing the stuff as China is. So there's going to be a cost. It should be.
Well, one of the
but
reasons that Apple wants to just diversify is because they're worried about increasing tension between our nation and China. Where will we be if we're highly dependent on China for important drugs and tensions continue to escalate? If Mr. Xi makes his goal of attacking Taiwan by 2027, that was recently publicized, where will we be then, Henry, with our drug supply?
You're right, Jack. Or if we put economic sanctions on China for one reason or another, for political reasons, you know, they really have us by the short hairs on
Right,
many
there
of
goes
these.
the vitamin C. We won't be able to supplement our.
Well,
But this is really all about shooting ourselves in the foot. We're the problem here.
Yeah.
We have all of these ridiculous regulations, and the FDA is among the larger of them. Of course, the EPA and so forth. But we're doing this to ourselves. So, you know, when Alan talks about how more expensive it is to do it in other countries, you know, we got to look in the mirror and say, whoa, why isn't it done here?
Yep.
But you're right. And I'll give you a current example of how FDA has shot us more specifically, has shot poultry farmers in the foot. There's a terrible epidemic of avian flu throughout the US, especially in the Midwest and mountain states, and also abroad. The UK is experiencing a terrible avian flu outbreak. One of the early promises of genetic engineering was going to be genetically engineered animals, specifically pigs and chickens that were resistant to viral diseases. And avian flu was one of the prime ones. Well, FDA, in its infinite wisdom, decided that it was going to regulate genetically engineered animals as a new animal drug, like flea medicine or antibiotics. And the first product that they were faced with was the fast-growing Aqua Advantage salmon, the genetically engineered Atlantic salmon. FDA somehow managed to do a 22-year review of that obviously benign, beneficial product. And so as a result, there's only been one other genetically engineered animal approved by FDA. That entire sector has virtually collapsed. So there's a perfect example. That gets us into another subject area of really terrible, regressive, anti-scientific, anti-innovative, colossally stupid regulation by US agencies.
Yep.
Did I leave anything out? any adjectives
Well,
out there?
the one other thing that I don't subscribe to this position, but I know it's been going to be thrown at you, and that is thalidomide. That was approved in Europe, and I don't recall how long it took before they found out that it had serious side effects. But they're going to say, we can't do that. Ours is better because we caught thalidomide and they didn't.
Actually,
Well,
they
there's a
didn't catch it.
side of thalidomide that's often left out of the story, and Henry, you know where I wrote about this. 3 major pharmaceutical companies in the United States had rejected thalidomide. It was only one small company that didn't have the same standard that went ahead and produced it. So it wasn't just some lady at the FDA who was later made a hero, but our own pharmaceutical firms recognized it as a problematic drug.
Yeah, but the other thing is, I think there's been a lot of studies done that have basically shown that thalidomide has caused way more deaths in the fact that the FDA has delayed appropriate drugs. That has killed many more people than were ever hurt by thalidomide.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that
That's
is
the argument that I use, but I know it's going to be thrown out there. I mean, I used that on this forum on here a month or so ago, and that's the one that was thrown back at me. Well, the FDA protected us from thalidomide. Okay, fine.
yeah, but in Europe, thalidomide was approved before you had to do clinical trials for those kinds of products. It was approved basically on the basis of animal studies. Certainly, it was never studied in carefully in pregnant women, which is what would have to be the case now in order for your labeling to be approved for them.
Although now I thought I read that they're thinking about using thalidomide as a cancer treatment.
Oh, it's approved. Yeah.
It is approved for a different use nowadays.
Now, one other thing that I know back in the 70s when I worked for Pfizer had a very large factory down in Puerto Rico, and they told me that it was there because they got a huge tax break for having that there. And then sometime shortly after I left, they closed it down, and I don't know why. I know they also had a big operation in Australia.
I can tell you, being very close to both to Puerto Rico and to that situation, what happened is in the 90s, sometime the US decided that those companies that were getting all of those breaks shouldn't be getting those breaks anymore, and they withdrew the breaks, and that's why those places all closed down in Puerto Rico, and they withdrew from Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico, although has some very good elements of for pharmaceutical, they have very high energy costs, and it wasn't efficient to have them there without the tax break. So that's what happened. It would have been much better for everybody if it had continued, but it didn't.
There was also a lot of issues with quality control and quality assurance oversight. And I know that a number of factories closed because it was too expensive to bring them up to the level they would need after they'd been inspected by the FDA and told of all the deficiencies that were operating there.
Okay.
But you're right. I mean, that every company had a Puerto Rican manufacturing plant, and now I don't think any of them do.
Yeah, I checked, they don't.
It occurs to me that an underlying concept between a lot of the issues we've been discussing is resilience, societal resilience, the drug supplies resilience to setbacks. And another good example of that is there, as you know, there have been some terrible frosts in the last couple of months. In December, Central Florida experienced awful frosts that did damage to stone fruits and especially citrus. And again, we have regulators to thank for the lack of resilience to potential frost damage. And that's not an FDA fault, that's an EPA fault. In the 80s, well, I should say, go back a little bit. Frost damage of crops is promoted by a ubiquitous bacterium that lives on leaves and stems and so on, Pseudomonas syringae. And the frost is promoted by a so-called ice nucleation protein that's in the bacteria, and it serves as a nidus or focus for ice crystals and damages crops at a higher temperature than would otherwise be the case. So scientists in industry and at Berkeley thought if we could produce an ice minus version, genetically engineered version of P. syringae that lacked the ice nucleation protein, and we sprayed that on crops, maybe it would ameliorate, prevent frost damage. And it worked. It did work on tests on tomatoes and potatoes. But EPA decided that this product was a pesticide because frost is a pest, and anything that mitigates a pest is a pesticide, which, as I've said in print, is the same rationale that could be used to regulate trash can lids as a pesticide because they mitigate raccoons, which are a pest. So this is the rationale EPA used, and again, this product dropped off the drawing boards because no company wanted to go through pesticide registration and carry the stigma of a pesticide label. So again, government regulators can do tremendous damage to our societal resilience in so many ways by making bad decisions, policy decisions, or individual product decisions.
We actually used that for a couple of years on our citrus. It was reasonably effective. It's only good for a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, but those are huge numbers. A couple of degrees that's very significant. I never understood why it went away, but we were no longer able to purchase it.
How did you get it? From whom? And
our chemical supplier had it. And so we sprayed it on commercial operations. It was a 100-acre orchard, and we were allowed to use it, and we were far from alone. This was San Diego County.
It's fascinating.
Tom, do you mind if I ask a question a little bit off Henry's topic? Henry, do you mind? Because I gather there's a lot of pharmaceutical talent on this call. A few weeks ago, Josh Bloom wrote a piece for the Dispatch on the lifespan, shelf life of drugs. Now, his principal point was that for analgesics, the lifespan is very long. And so tossing out all your Vicodin or whatever doesn't make sense. Hang on to it. You might need it in the future. But if you read all the way to the bottom, he said that's not true for antibiotics, that antibiotics do not have a long shelf life. That disappointed me because when I travel with some antibiotics that I had left over from prior episodes, a Z-Pak, for instance, and some Cipro. So I'm just wondering, was Josh on the mark there when he said, don't hang on to antibiotics for very long after their prescribed life?
Henry?
I don't know. Anyone else?
So I can take a little stab at this. And, you know, the problem with generalizations is that they're generalizations, right?
Right.
And when you think of antibiotics normally, you know, a big part of that generally comes down to the ones that are in common use, like penicillins and cephalosporins. And those drugs in particular are problematic because of their stability. You know, essentially the way they work, they're electrophilic and they pick up a nucleophile and you basically get a chemical reaction. Well, instead of it, a penicillin, acylate and a penicillin binding protein like it would if it was killing a bacteria, water can also act as that nucleophile and open up the beta-lactam ring. And so over time, you know, the drugs basically will decay. And so penicillins and cephalosporins definitely wouldn't use longer than the expiration date. On the other hand, I think quinolones and you mentioned Z-Pak, I don't know that they're inherently unstable. So quite frankly, there's nothing in the quinolone structure that would make me feel it's going to fall apart. And unless it's, and again, it depends on storage conditions, right? Because quinolones, basically, if you left them in the light, they probably, you know, be some sort of photocatalysis that would break them down. Whereas, you know, I think if you had them in a dark pouch in a dark room, the other thing, and you know, a friend of mine at Gilead used to do this. He was concerned about his Tamiflu degrading if he left it in his briefcase over time. So when he had a stockpile, he would put most of it in his freezer, and then just because obviously decay rates are going to be a lot less at the lower temperatures. And
Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay.
But
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
But some drugs
It's the Cipro.
might be altered if they freeze, right?
The big problem with freezing is when you get into things like proteins and things of that nature. I think for most chemical drugs, a lower temperature is generally associated with a slower decay rate.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Well, Jack, thank you for the question. That's kind of bothered me since then also. Appreciate that.
I have one for Henry now. Before we lose you today, what's going on in the leadership office of the FDA? Are you fond of or disparaging the current commissioner's performance?
Well, I think Califf is neither
We
very
don't
good.
quote you, of course.
Okay. He's Califf is neither very good nor very bad. He's a smart guy, but he's more an academic who's interested in the nuances of clinical trials and so on than he is in being a reformer. And Jeff Steyer and I said that when he was being considered for commissioner. We need an aggressive reformer, and no president and staff have been interested in appointing one. And so that's the problem. That's where we are. I think he's better than some that we've had in recent iterations. But he's not giving us what society needs and what the companies and consumers need in the way of reform.
Are the likes of Sidney Wolf and people like him still influencing this? Remember, he said that nobody who had ever had any experience in the pharmaceutical firm should ever be considered for the FDA. Is that still a principle?
Yeah, whom should we get? It's like the criticisms of the so-called revolving door from regulatory agencies to industry. Why wouldn't they want to hire somebody who knows about regulation?
Right.
And of course it works the other way as well.
And vice versa, exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
So,
Can I ask some totally unrelated questions that have been dealt with by this organization before, but because things keep changing, it makes my head hurt?
But
That-
just remember, if it's an area outside of one of our expertises, then
If it is, then we can shove it for another day. But the two things that bother me that I can't get my hands around is, does it make any sense for kids to get COVID vaccinations, and do masks work? What people tell me is they don't work well at all. But other people will say, well, if they work even 2%, it's better to wear them than to not. But then that doesn't consider the potential negatives. So is there any real answer to those questions, or is it still up for discussion?
high
Henry?
quality masks work very well, very, very well. And they've tested them in experimental situations and in real world situations. The mask skeptics are quacks, basically. They're cranks. We've had almost 2,000 kids die of COVID. Yes, they should be vaccinated, not only for their own sake, but because they're vectors of infectious diseases. They go to school, they come home with the flu or COVID or RSV, and they transmit it to their siblings and parents and grandparents and others in the community. So absolutely, the COVID vaccines are some of the most safe ever. They're not as effective as they were originally, but they're still very effective, especially if carried through to the boosters.
Let's not forget that surgeons have been wearing masks all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. Now, admittedly, those masks were impeding the transmission of bacteria, which are a lot bigger than viruses.
Yeah.
But Henry, wasn't it true that a UK study showed that COVID is dose related? That even if you can cut down the volume of viral exposure, which a mask can do, you're going to be better off.
Oh yeah, and there was an interesting study of comparing two individuals, an experimental study of two individuals encountering each other for a certain amount of time, and how long it would take of interaction to get an infectious dose if one or both of them had a surgical mask, a high capacity mask, a high performance mask, and so on. And the differences were extraordinary, which is exactly what you would expect.
Yeah.
The other thing that they never mentioned that you can do to help control the aerosol spread is when you're talking with someone, talk down towards the ground, because then your aerosols are going down and not over towards their mouth. It's that simple. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to try to prevent the aerosols from getting into your friends.
Tom wants us to talk down to everybody.
Yeah,
You heard it.
basically that's it.
So one of the things about masks that Henry pitched, and I'll reiterate, is, it's got to be the right kind of mask. A piece of cloth across your face doesn't do as good, anything like as good as having a proper, fitted mask that's actually, shaped to the contours of your face, etc. And I'm always fascinated by the number of people that still want to wear a mask and leave it right below their nose. And there's people out there, and it's like, why are you even bothering?
Well, there's a guy at the gym that actually wears it under his chin.
That's
One
probably
good
more useful.
One good development is we're not seeing many bandanas anymore.
Yeah,
That's true. But the other thing, to Jack's point about the size of, a virus versus a bacteria, viruses don't exist as viruses because they become dehydrated very quickly if they're not in a fluid drop. So it's the size of the fluid drop that's got to get through the mask and not the virus itself.
Yeah. Good point.
Very good, good point.
Anything else?
No,
Well,
thanks
my
for a
thanks to
fun time.
everyone.
My thanks to you all. You were a terrific group.
And thank you, Henry. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Hope
Bye.
to have one in March. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.